Detective James Carter sat in his own BMW, watching two racist cops approach with their hands on their weapons, and realized that 15 years of internal affairs work had led him to this moment, where being black in America might get him killed by the very badge he'd sworn to honor. He turned off the engine of his midnight blue BMW and checked his watch. 10:15 p.m. He'd positioned himself deliberately in the parking lot of Westfield Shopping Center, knowing full well what officers Derek Martinez and Cole Thompson did to black men they found in upscale neighborhoods after dark. Ready for the complete story? Smash that subscribe button and tell me where you are tuning in from in the comments. Tomorrow brings another mind-blowing story that's just as unbelievable. Trust me, you will want to be here for it. Alright, let's jump into it. For 6 months, Internal Affairs had been building a case against the two officers. What started as complaints about racial profiling had evolved into something much darker: whispers of missing persons, unexplained cash deposits, and connections to the Kozlov crime family that ran human trafficking operations throughout the tri-state area. James adjusted the hidden camera clipped to his jacket button and settled back into the leather seat. At 36, he'd spent 12 years with the department, the last 5 working Internal Affairs. Tonight, he was playing the role of Marcus Williams, a successful black businessman who'd made the mistake of driving through the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. His phone buzzed with a text from his handler, Captain Rodriguez. Martinez and Thompson just left the precinct. ETA 8 minutes. Remember, you're just a guy getting coffee. Stay in character. James typed back quickly, copy. Rolling camera now. The parking lot stretched empty around him, most shops closed except for the 24-hour diner at the far end. Perfect hunting ground for predators with badges. James had studied Martinez and Thompson's pattern for months. They targeted successful-looking black men driving expensive cars, claiming suspicious activity, before searching for drugs they'd often plant themselves. But the Internal Affairs investigation had uncovered something much worse. Bank records showed deposits that couldn't be explained by police salaries. Surveillance footage from the docks showed both officers meeting with known associates of Viktor Kozlov, whose organization smuggled everything from weapons to women through the port. James's hands tightened on the steering wheel as headlights swept across his rearview mirror. A black and white patrol car, moving slowly, predatorially through the lot. Here we go. The patrol car pulled up behind his BMW, and James felt his pulse quicken despite his years of experience. He wasn't just dealing with corrupt cops tonight. He was dealing with men connected to killers, traffickers, and worse. Officer Martinez stepped out first, a stocky man with dead eyes and a smile that never reached them. Thompson followed, younger but meaner, with the kind of swagger that comes from knowing the system will protect you no matter what you do. James rolled down his window as they approached, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. "Evening, officers," he said politely. "Is there a problem?" Martinez leaned down, his breath smelling of coffee and cigarettes. "License and registration. Now. May I ask what this is about?" James kept his tone respectful, professional, exactly what a law-abiding citizen would do. "Don't ask questions," Thompson snapped from the passenger side. "Just do what you're told, boy." The racial slur hung in the air like poison. James felt anger flare in his chest, but kept his expression neutral. The camera was recording everything. "Of course, officer." James reached slowly for his glove compartment, pulling out the registration for the BMW. Then he reached for his wallet, extracting his fake ID, Marcus Williams, age 34, investment banker. Martinez studied the documents under his flashlight, taking longer than necessary. "Marcus Williams, huh? What's a guy like you doing in a neighborhood like this so late at night?" "Getting coffee," James replied simply. "The diner stays open late, and I work long hours." "Investment banker," Thompson read over Martinez's shoulder. "Making good money, I bet. How much this car cost you, Marcus?" "I work hard for what I have," James said carefully. "I bet you do," Martinez said, but there was something else in his voice now. Something calculating. "Step out of the vehicle, please." James's internal alarms began screaming. This was moving faster than the typical harassment pattern. "Is that really necessary? I haven't done anything wrong." "Step out of the vehicle. Now." Thompson's hand moved to his service weapon. James complied, moving slowly and deliberately. As he stood beside his BMW, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Martinez was scanning the license plate into his phone, but not through official police channels. He was using a private app. These officers weren't just profiling him, they were documenting him for someone else. "Turn around, hands on the car," Martinez ordered. As James placed his palms against the BMW's hood, Thompson began searching him. Professional, thorough, but not following standard police procedure. They were looking for something specific. "No weapons," Thompson reported. "But look what we have here." James felt his heart stop as Thompson pulled out his backup phone, the one containing direct contact with Captain Rodriguez and the Internal Affairs team. "Two phones, Marcus?" Martinez's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Investment bankers need two phones these days." "One's personal, one's business," James said quickly. "You know how it is." Martinez scrolled through the phone's contact list, and James watched his face change. The predatory smile faded, replaced by something much more dangerous: recognition. Well, Martinez said slowly. "Looks like we caught ourselves a rat, Thompson." They knew exactly who he was. Thompson's hand went to his weapon immediately. Internal Affairs scum. James's training kicked in. In one fluid motion, he spun away from the car, his hand going for his concealed Glock. But Thompson was faster, his service pistol already clearing leather. The first shot shattered the BMW's rear window. James dove behind the engine block as a second shot sparked off the concrete beside his head. "Should have minded your own business, Detective Carter," Martinez shouted, taking cover behind their patrol car. "Kozlov doesn't like people sniffing around his operations." The corruption went deeper than drugs and harassment. They were working directly for the Kozlov crime family. James drew his weapon and returned fire, the muzzle flash lighting up the empty parking lot. His shot spiderwebbed the patrol car's windshield, sending both officers diving for better cover. "Rodriguez, I need backup at Westfield Shopping Center," James shouted into his radio. "Officers Martinez and Thompson are dirty. They're shooting at me." Static answered him. Then Martinez's laughter echoed across the lot. "Your radio won't work, Carter. We've been jamming Internal Affairs frequencies for months. Kozlov's got people everywhere, including your precious IA department." The corruption reached into Internal Affairs itself. James was truly alone. James's mind raced as bullets pinged off the BMW around him. 6 months of investigation, and he'd walked straight into a trap. But how had they known? Who had betrayed him? As if reading his thoughts, Martinez called out, "You want to know how we knew you were coming? Your own captain sold you out, Carter. Rodriguez has been on Kozlov's payroll for 2 years." The words hit James like a physical blow. Captain Rodriguez, his mentor, his friend, the man who'd recruited him for Internal Affairs, was the leak. Thompson moved to flank him, using abandoned shopping carts as cover. James had maybe 15 rounds left, and they had backup coming. He needed to end this quickly. "Give it up, Carter," Thompson shouted. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. Maybe if you cooperate, Kozlov will let you live." James rose from cover and fired 3 quick shots, driving Thompson back behind a concrete pillar. "The only thing I'm giving up tonight is your badges, permanently." As sirens began wailing in the distance, James realized this was either his salvation or his death sentence. In a department riddled with corruption, who could he trust? The shootout intensified as more patrol cars arrived, but James couldn't tell which officers were there to help him and which were there to kill him. The approaching sirens grew louder, but James couldn't tell if they carried salvation or execution. 3 more patrol cars screamed into the parking lot, their red and blue lights painting the night in chaotic colors. James pressed himself against the BMW's engine block, counting ammunition. 12 rounds left. Against how many corrupt cops? His radio crackled with static, still jammed. The hidden camera on his jacket had been recording everything, but that evidence would die with him if he couldn't survive the next few minutes. "That's backup," Thompson shouted triumphantly. "You're finished, Carter." But as the patrol cars positioned themselves around the lot, James noticed something strange. Instead of forming a coordinated perimeter to trap him, 2 of the vehicles moved to block Martinez and Thompson's escape routes. The 3rd car's door opened, and Detective Lisa Park stepped out, James's former partner from narcotics, before his transfer to internal affairs. She moved with tactical precision, her weapon drawn but not aimed at him. "Martinez." "Thompson." Park's voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Drop your weapons. Now." James felt a surge of hope, but kept his position. In a department riddled with corruption, trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Park." Martinez called out, confusion evident in his voice. "What the hell are you doing? Carter's the target here." "The only targets I see are 2 dirty cops shooting at a fellow detective," Park replied coldly. "Last warning, drop your weapons." Thompson's response was a wild shot in Park's direction. The bullet sparked off her patrol car's hood, and all hell broke loose. The parking lot erupted in crossfire as clean cops fought dirty ones, with James caught in the middle. Park and the 2 other responding officers, Detectives Kim and Foster from Homicide, returned fire with professional precision. James realized that while internal affairs had been compromised, other departments were fighting back against the corruption. "Carter!" Park shouted over the gunfire. "Rodriguez is dead. Shot in his office 20 minutes ago. We found your backup files. We know everything." James's world tilted. Rodriguez, his mentor, his supposed betrayer, was dead? The pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. Rodriguez hadn't betrayed James. Someone else in internal affairs had, and they'd killed Rodriguez to frame him posthumously. "Who's the leak?" James called back, rising to provide covering fire as Park advanced on Thompson's position. "Deputy Chief Morrison." Park answered. "He's been feeding information to Kozlov for 3 years. Rodriguez discovered it tonight, that's why they killed him." Morrison. James felt sick. The deputy chief had personally approved this operation, had access to all their intelligence, had positioned James perfectly for an ambush. Thompson broke cover, making a desperate run for the diner. James tracked him with his pistol, leading the target, accounting for movement and distance. The shot took Thompson in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon skittering across the asphalt. Martinez, seeing his partner down, made his own run, not for the diner, but for James's BMW. "He's going for your car," Kim shouted. James realized Martinez's plan a split second too late. The corrupt officer wasn't trying to escape, he was going for something in the BMW. Something James hadn't known was there. Martinez reached the car and pulled something from under the driver's seat, a small black device, military grade. A tracking beacon. Kozlov's been watching you for months, Carter. Martinez screamed, holding the device like a trophy. Every move you made, every meeting you had, every safe house you thought was secret, we knew it all. James's entire investigation had been monitored from the beginning. His car, his movements, even his safe houses had been compromised. The revelation hit James like a physical blow. For 6 months, he'd thought he was hunting predators, but he'd been the mouse in their maze all along. Every piece of evidence he'd gathered, every contact he'd made, every move he'd planned, Kozlov's organization had been 3 steps ahead. Park flanked Martinez while he was distracted with his revelation. "Drop the device, Martinez. It's over." "Over." Martinez laughed maniacally. "You have no idea what you're up against. Kozlov owns judges, prosecutors, half the police department. Kill me, and 10 more will take my place." "Maybe," Park said calmly, "but you won't be around to see it." Martinez raised his weapon toward Park, but James was already moving. His final shot took Martinez center mass, dropping him beside the BMW. The parking lot fell silent except for the distant wail of ambulances and the labored breathing of wounded men. As EMTs worked on Thompson and pronounced Martinez dead at the scene, James stared at the tracking device in Park's hands. The full scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear and terrifying. "How long have you known about Morrison?" James asked as they watched Martinez's body being loaded into the coroner's van. "About 6 hours, Park replied grimly. "Rodriguez called me tonight, said he'd found something that would blow the department apart. When I got to his office, he was already dead, but he'd left files hidden in his desk. Morrison's financial records, photos of him meeting with Kozlov's lieutenants, communications about removing the internal affairs problem." James felt the weight of survival and loss in equal measure. "Rodriguez saved my life, even after they killed him." "He saved all our lives," Detective Kim interjected, joining them. "Morrison was planning to eliminate anyone who might expose the operation. Rodriguez, you, half the clean cops in the department. Tonight was supposed to be a massacre disguised as a gang shooting." Foster approached, his phone pressed to his ear. "FBI's en route. They've had a task force investigating Kozlov for 2 years, but couldn't penetrate his police connections. With Martinez dead and Thompson talking, they've got their opening." James looked around the bullet-scarred parking lot, processing how close he'd come to death. What about the human trafficking? The weapons smuggling? "That's the big prize," Park said. "Thompson's already trying to cut a deal. Says he can give them locations, schedules, the whole network. Kozlov's operation is about to come crashing down." As federal agents flooded the scene, James realized that his near-death experience had inadvertently triggered the largest organized crime takedown in the city's history. But even as justice began its slow grind forward, James couldn't shake the feeling that they'd only cut off one tentacle of a much larger beast. Corruption like this didn't exist in isolation. It grew in systems that protected it, nurtured it, rewarded it. Thompson, handcuffed to a gurney as EMTs treated his shoulder wound, caught James's eye. "You think this is over, Carter?" Thompson wheezed. "You think catching Morrison and shutting down one operation ends anything? Kozlov's got connections you can't imagine. Federal judges, senators, people who could make all of this disappear with a phone call." James leaned close to the gurney. "Maybe. But tonight, justice starts with you telling the truth. Every name, every location, every crime you've witnessed or participated in. You do that and maybe you get to see your kids grow up in prison instead of a cemetery." Thompson's defiant expression cracked, replaced by something that might have been fear, or regret, or just exhaustion. "I want a lawyer," he whispered. "And I want witness protection. If I talk, Kozlov will kill my family." "That's not my department anymore," James said, straightening up. "But I'll make sure the feds know you're willing to cooperate." As the crime scene slowly cleared and the first hints of dawn touched the eastern horizon, James stood alone beside his bullet-scarred BMW. In 12 hours, his entire world had been torn apart and rebuilt. Rodriguez was dead. Martinez was dead. Thompson would spend the rest of his life in prison. Morrison would be arrested before the sun fully rose. But the cost felt almost too heavy to bear. 3 days after the parking lot shootout, Detective James Carter sat in a sterile FBI conference room, staring at a wall covered with photographs, documents, and a red string connecting dozens of faces. The Kozlov investigation had exploded into something that dwarfed his original internal affairs case. Special Agent Sarah Chun, lead investigator for the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force, spread additional files across the table. "Thompson's been talking for 72 hours straight. What he's given us. Christ, Carter, this goes deeper than we ever imagined." James studied the crime web laid out before him. Viktor Kozlov's organization wasn't just running guns and trafficking humans. They were systematically corrupting law enforcement agencies across 3 states, creating a network of protection that had operated undetected for over a decade. "How many cops are we talking about?" James asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "In your department alone?" 47 officers, 12 detectives, 6 lieutenants, 3 captains, and Deputy Chief Morrison. Chen's voice was flat, professional, but James could hear the disgust underneath. "That's nearly a third of the force." The numbers hit James like physical blows. A third of his colleagues, people he'd worked with, trusted, shared coffee and war stories with, were criminals wearing badges. Agent Chen pulled out a thick folder marked Priority, Eyes Only. "But here's where it gets really ugly. Thompson gave us details about something called Operation Cleanup." James opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. His blood turned to ice as he read. Operation Cleanup was a systematic plan to eliminate honest cops, prosecutors, and federal agents who were getting too close to the truth. James's investigation had triggered an acceleration of the plan. "They weren't just going to kill me," James said, reading through hit lists and assassination schedules. "They were planning to take out 15 law enforcement officers across 3 agencies." "Rodriguez was just the beginning," Chen confirmed. "You, Detective Park, Assistant DA Martinez, who'd been investigating police corruption cases, FBI Agent Williams, who'd been tracking human trafficking routes, all of you were marked for elimination within the next month." James felt sick. His investigation hadn't just exposed corruption, it had signed death warrants for every honest cop who'd been doing their job. "There's more," Chen said grimly. "Kozlov didn't build this network from scratch. He had help. High-level help." She placed a photograph on the table that made James's world tilt. Mayor Patricia Thornton, shaking hands with a man James recognized from surveillance photos as Dmitry Kozlov, Victor's brother and second-in-command. "The mayor." James whispered. "Not just the mayor. Federal Judge Harrison, who's been dismissing cases against Kozlov associates for 2 years. State Senator Williams, who's been blocking organized crime legislation. Even," Chen hesitated. "Even what?" "Even Assistant Director Morrison from the FBI's regional office. He's been feeding information to Kozlov about federal investigations." The corruption reached into the highest levels of local, state, and federal government. James wasn't just fighting dirty cops, he was fighting a shadow government. James pushed back from the table, overwhelmed. How do we fight something this big? If they own judges, senators, even federal officials. We start with what we can prove, Chen said. Thompson's testimony gives us enough to roll up the street-level operations. Every arrest leads to more information, more evidence. We work our way up the chain. A knock at the conference room door interrupted them. Agent Williams entered, his expression grim. "We've got a problem," Williams announced. "Assistant Director Morrison just ordered the suspension of this investigation. Says it's based on unreliable witness testimony from a wounded criminal trying to avoid prison time." Chen swore under her breath. "He's trying to bury us." James stood up, decision crystallizing in his mind. "Then we go around him." "How?" Thompson mentioned meeting locations, safe houses, scheduled operations. "We don't need Morrison's permission to observe public places and follow leads. We build an ironclad case from the ground up." James realized that fighting corruption at this level meant abandoning official channels and operating in the shadows, becoming the very thing he'd spent his career fighting against. Chen studied him carefully. "You're talking about operating outside federal authority. If Morrison finds out..." "If Morrison finds out, I'll already be dead," James said bluntly. "Either we do this, or Kozlov completes his cleanup operation and all of this disappears forever." Williams moved to the wall of evidence, studying the connections. "There's a scheduled meeting tomorrow night. Kozlov's bringing in a new shipment, 23 women from Eastern Europe, plus military-grade weapons from his contacts in the Russian mob." James examined the intelligence. The meeting was set for Pier 47, an abandoned shipping terminal that had been shuttered for environmental violations 2 years earlier. Perfect cover for criminal operations. "How many of our people can we trust?" James asked. "Define our people," Chen replied cynically. "In your department, maybe a dozen clean cops. In the FBI, perhaps 6 agents who aren't connected to Morrison. Not exactly an army. Then we make do with what we have." James moved to the evidence wall, studying photographs of Kozlov's key operatives. "What about media? Can we get reporters involved?" Williams shook his head. "Kozlov owns the publisher of the Herald, and the TV stations won't run stories without official confirmation from law enforcement." James felt the walls closing in from all sides. Kozlov had spent years building a web of corruption and influence that seemed impenetrable. But every web had weak points, places where the strands were thinner, more vulnerable. "What about the victims?" James asked suddenly. "The women being trafficked, the families of cops who've been killed or forced out. They don't have anything to lose by speaking out." Chen's eyes lit up with understanding. "A civilian witness campaign. If we can't get official investigations, we create enough public pressure to force action." "It's dangerous," Williams warned. "Kozlov doesn't hesitate to eliminate civilians who threaten his operations." "Then we make sure they're protected," James said. "And we move fast, before Morrison can shut us down completely." "What do you think is James's most dangerous enemy? The corrupt cops, the crime boss, or the system itself that protects them all? Let me know in the comments what you think his biggest challenge will be." As they began planning their unsanctioned operation, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to cross a line that would change everything. Fighting corruption from within the system was one thing. Operating outside the law to enforce justice was something else entirely. But as he looked at the photographs of trafficking victims, young women who disappeared into Kozlov's network, never to be seen again, James realized that some lines were worth crossing. "Tomorrow night," he said finally. "We end this, one way or another." Chen nodded grimly. "Tomorrow night, we either save this city or go down fighting." The weight of that commitment settled on James's shoulders like a shroud. In his career, he'd always believed that justice worked within the system. Now he was about to discover what happened when the system itself became the enemy. The abandoned Pier 47 looked like a graveyard of industrial dreams under the pale moon. Rusted cranes stretched toward the sky like skeletal fingers, and the smell of stagnant water mixed with decades of oil spills hung heavy in the salt air. James Carter crouched behind a stack of rotting shipping containers, checking his watch, 11:23 p.m. 17 minutes until Viktor Kozlov's convoy was scheduled to arrive with their human cargo. Through his earpiece, Agent Chen's voice crackled with static, "Overwatch in position. I count 4 vehicles approaching from the north access road." James adjusted his night vision scope, scanning the pier. His army consisted of 6 people willing to risk their careers and lives: Chun, Williams, Detective Park, Detective Kim, Detective Foster, and himself. Against Kozlov's entire operation. The odds were insane. The plan was desperate. But it was all they had. "Movement on the south side," Detective Park whispered through the comm. She was positioned near the main warehouse with Kim, ready to document everything they could capture. 2 more vehicles, plus what looks like a refrigerated truck. James's stomach clenched. The refrigerated truck would contain the women, 23 young lives reduced to cargo in Kozlov's sick economy. "Remember," James said quietly into his mic, "we're here to gather evidence and protect the victims. We don't engage unless they start shooting first." But even as he said it, James knew the chances of this ending peacefully were virtually zero. Kozlov didn't leave witnesses, and he certainly wouldn't let federal agents walk away with evidence of his trafficking operation. The first convoy vehicles pulled onto the pier, 3 black SUVs with tinted windows. Professional, military-precise movements as armed men emerged to secure the area. These weren't street thugs or corrupt cops. These were soldiers. "Jesus," Williams breathed from his position near the water. "These guys are carrying serious hardware. Assault rifles, body armor, radio coordination. This is a paramilitary operation." James focused his scope on the lead vehicle as Viktor Kozlov himself stepped out. Even from a distance, the crime boss radiated dangerous authority. Tall, immaculately dressed despite the industrial setting, moving with the confidence of a man who owned everything he surveyed. As Kozlov's men spread out to secure the pier, James realized they weren't just positioned defensively, they were positioned to trap someone. This wasn't just a business meeting. It was an ambush. "Chun, something's wrong," James whispered urgently. "They're not setting up for a transaction. They're setting up for a fight." Before Chun could respond, James heard the distinctive sound of multiple helicopters approaching. His blood turned to ice as he recognized the aircraft, police helicopters, but flying with their lights off. "We've been set up," he said into his comm. "Morrison knew we were coming." The truth hit him like a sledgehammer. Assistant Director Morrison hadn't just tried to shut down their investigation, he'd fed their location to Kozlov. The 6 honest officers weren't here to gather evidence. They were here to be eliminated. The pier erupted in coordinated chaos as corrupt federal agents and local police surrounded James's team, while Kozlov's private army moved in from waterfront. "All units, this is Agent Morrison," a familiar voice crackled over an open frequency. "We have federal fugitives operating without authorization. Use any force necessary to apprehend." James grabbed his radio. "This is Detective Carter to any honest cops listening. Morrison is corrupt. He's working with organized crime. Do not comply with his orders." But even as he spoke, James knew it was hopeless. How many officers receiving Morrison's orders knew the truth? How many would risk their careers on the word of a supposedly rogue detective? Muzzle flashes erupted from 3 directions as the trap closed. James rolled behind better cover as bullets sparked off the shipping container beside him. Through his earpiece, he heard Park's voice, tight with pain. "I'm hit. Kim, I need." The transmission cut to static. As the firefight intensified, James realized the refrigerated truck wasn't just carrying trafficking victims. It was carrying evidence that could bring down the entire conspiracy, including files that Morrison had been desperately trying to destroy. "Williams!" James shouted over the gunfire. "The truck! We need to get to that refrigerated truck." "Are you insane?" Williams called back from behind an overturned forklift. "There's 50 armed hostiles between us and—" A sniper's bullet cut through the air inches from Williams' head, shattering his response into scattered curses. Chen's voice crackled through the comm. "Carter, I'm seeing federal warrant paperwork in Morrison's vehicle. This whole operation, they're planning to frame us as the criminals. Dead cops can't testify to their own innocence." The full scope of Morrison's plan crystallized in James's mind. Kill the honest officers, plant evidence of corruption on their bodies, and present Viktor Kozlov as a cooperating witness in a federal sting operation. The media would report that corrupt cops had been eliminated while protecting organized crime. Morrison would be the hero who cleaned up the department. Perfect cover for the real criminals. "Foster, what's your status?" James called into his comm. "Static." Then Foster's voice, weak and strained, pinned down near the warehouse. "Multiple hostiles. I've got eyes on the truck, but... Carter, there are people inside. Living people. I can hear them. 23 women, trapped in a metal box while bullets flew around them. If a stray round punctured the truck's refrigeration system, they could die from toxic gas exposure." James made a decision that went against every tactical principle he'd ever learned. He broke cover, sprinting across open ground toward the refrigerated truck. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions, bullets whining past his head and sparking off concrete. James Dove rolled, came up running. A round caught his shoulder, spinning him partially around, but adrenaline kept him moving. Behind him, he heard Chen's voice screaming into her radio, "This is Agent Chun to FBI Emergency Response. We need immediate backup at Pier 47. Assistant Director Morrison is in league with organized crime. Repeat, Morrison is dirty." James reached the truck as bullets shattered its rear windows. Inside, he could hear terrified voices speaking in what sounded like Russian and Romanian. He yanked on the rear doors, locked with a heavy chain and padlock. "Hang on," he shouted, hoping they could understand. "I'm police. I'm here to help." A burst from his Glock shattered the padlock. The doors swung open, revealing a sight that would haunt James for the rest of his life. 23 women, ages ranging from maybe 16 to 30, huddled together in the darkness. Bruised, terrified, but alive. At the front of the group, a young woman with fierce dark eyes stepped forward. "You are really police?" she asked in heavily accented English. "Not like the others." "I'm really police," James said, helping her down from the truck. "And I'm going to get all of you out of here." But as James began evacuating the women from the truck, he realized they were still trapped on a pier surrounded by hostile forces. Saving them from the truck was only the beginning. Now he had to keep them alive long enough for real help to arrive. Viktor Kozlov's voice echoed across the pier through a portable bullhorn. "Detective Carter, your heroics are impressive, but pointless. Release my property, and I'll make your death quick." James positioned himself between the women and Kozlov's advancing soldiers. His shoulder burned where the bullet had grazed him, and he was down to his last magazine of ammunition. But looking at the faces of the women behind him, seeing hope replace despair in their eyes, James knew that some battles were worth fighting even when you couldn't win. James Carter counted his remaining ammunition as Viktor Kozlov's soldiers advanced through the maze of shipping containers. 8 rounds left. 23 innocent lives depending on him. And backup that might never come. "Stay behind me," James shouted to the women in English, then repeated it in broken Spanish, hoping someone would translate to the others. The young woman with dark eyes, she'd told him her name was Anya, was helping organize the group, keeping them low and together. Detective Foster's voice crackled through the damaged comm system. "Carter, I'm moving to your position. Kim and I are still mobile." "Negative," James replied, firing 2 shots at advancing figures. "Too much open ground. Hold your position and call for backup." But even as he said it, James knew they were on their own. Morrison had federal authority to block emergency response. The corrupt cops would ensure local units stayed away. This was exactly what Kozlov and his government allies wanted, a shootout that would end with all the witnesses dead. Anya crouched beside James, her eyes scanning the battlefield with surprising tactical awareness. "In my country, I was soldier before." She paused, pain flickering across her face. "Before they took me. I can help fight." James looked at her with new respect, but shook his head. "Your job is to keep the others safe. Get them to that warehouse, there's better cover. And leave you to die alone." Anya's accent thickened with emotion. "No. We survive together or not at all." As James prepared for what seemed like a hopeless last stand, Anya revealed that several of the women were former military personnel from their home countries. They weren't just victims, they were potential allies with combat training. "How many of you know how to fight?" James asked quickly. Anya spoke rapidly in what sounded like Romanian. 5 hands went up among the group. "We are not helpless," Anya said firmly. "Give us weapons, we help defend ourselves." James made a split-second decision that went against every protocol he'd ever learned. He pulled his backup .38 from his ankle holster and handed it to Anya. 5 shots. Make them count." As Kozlov's men closed the distance, James heard something that made his heart race, the distant sound of sirens. Real sirens, not Morrison's fake backup. Chen's voice burst through the static. "Carter, FBI emergency response is en route. Real agents, not Morrison's people. ETA 3 minutes. 3 minutes. James had to keep everyone alive for 3 more minutes. Viktor Kozlov appeared from behind a shipping container, flanked by 4 heavily armed soldiers. Even in the chaos of the firefight, he remained impeccably dressed, as if violence was just another business meeting. "Detective Carter," Kozlov called out conversationally. "You've caused me considerable inconvenience. Do you have any idea how expensive it is to rebuild operations like this?" James aimed his pistol at Kozlov's center mass. "Put down your weapons. You're surrounded." Kozlov laughed, the sound echoing off the pier structures. "Surrounded? By whom?" "Your corrupt FBI supervisor is dead. Unfortunate accident during the raid. Your fellow officers are pinned down or eliminated. It's just you, detective, standing between me and my property." James realized that Morrison had been killed by Kozlov to eliminate loose ends, meaning the corruption conspiracy was entering its final, most violent phase. "They're not property," James said, his voice carrying across the pier. "They're human beings. And you're never taking them back." "Such noble sentiments," Kozlov replied. "But nobility doesn't stop bullets." The crime boss gestured to his men, and James knew the final assault was about to begin. He braced himself behind the inadequate cover of the truck's rear bumper, knowing that his 8 rounds wouldn't stop 4 trained killers. But then Anya stood up beside him, the .38 held in a perfect two-handed grip. Behind her, the other 4 women with military training had armed themselves with tools from the pier, crowbars, heavy wrenches, anything that could be used as weapons. "You want us?" Anya called out to Kozlov in clear, unaccented English. "Come take us." Anya revealed she spoke perfect English and had been deliberately hiding her intelligence and training, waiting for the right moment to fight back. The shooting started from 3 directions simultaneously. James and Anya worked in perfect coordination, their combined fire forcing Kozlov's soldiers into cover. The other women flanked left and right, using their improvised weapons to attack anyone who got too close. James watched in amazement as these women, who'd been victims just minutes before, transformed into a coordinated fighting unit. Anya moved like a professional soldier, covering James's reload times and calling out tactical information in rapid-fire English. 2 approaching from the left. Sniper on the crane. Kozlov moving to the warehouse. Detective Park's voice suddenly crackled through the comm, weak but determined. "Carter, Kim and I are flanking from the south. Foster's moving on the sniper. Keep them busy for 30 more seconds." The pier erupted in the coordinated chaos of converging forces. James saw Detective Kim emerge from behind a container stack, his pistol tracking targets with professional precision. Park appeared despite her injury, moving with grim determination. Viktor Kozlov, realizing his advantage was evaporating, made a desperate play. He grabbed a grenade from his tactical vest and pulled the pin. "Everyone dies, or everyone surrenders," he screamed. "Your choice, detective." But Anya was already moving. With the fluid grace of someone who'd been trained for exactly this moment, she tackled Kozlov from the side. They went down together, rolling toward the edge of the pier as the grenade flew from Kozlov's hand into the dark water below. The explosion sent a geyser of water into the air, but it was muffled by the harbor's depth. James reached the struggling pair just as Kozlov drew a knife. The crime boss had inches and weight on Anya, but she fought with the desperate fury of someone who had nothing left to lose. James's final shot took Viktor Kozlov in the chest, ending the fight forever. As federal sirens wailed closer and the last of Kozlov's soldiers surrendered, James realized they had not just won a battle, they had broken the back of a conspiracy that had corrupted law enforcement for years. Real FBI agents flooded the pier, not Morrison's compromised unit, but emergency response teams from Washington who'd been alerted by Chen's emergency broadcast. The cleanup would take hours, but the immediate danger was over. James knelt beside Anya as EMTs checked her for injuries. She was bruised and exhausted, but her eyes held something they hadn't contained in the truck: hope. "Is over?" she asked quietly. "The fighting's over," James replied. "But now comes the hard part, making sure you and the others get real help, real protection, real justice." Anya gripped his hand with surprising strength. "In my country we have saying, the wolf dies, but the pack remembers. These men had many friends, yes? Many people who will want revenge." James nodded grimly. She was right. Kozlov's death would create a power vacuum, and someone would try to fill it. The corruption in the department would take years to fully root out. The federal investigation would drag on for months. But 23 women were free. A major trafficking operation was destroyed. And for the first time in years, James believed that justice could actually win. Detective Park approached, her arm in a sling but her expression triumphant. "Foster's alive. Kim's alive. We all made it, Carter." James looked around the pier, at the freed women being cared for by EMTs, at the federal agents processing the largest organized crime scene in the city's history, at his fellow officers who'd risked everything to do what was right. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We all made it." But as James gave his statement to federal investigators and watched the sun rise over the harbor, he knew this victory came with a price. His undercover career was over. Too many people knew his face now. The department would never be the same. And somewhere out there, other Viktor Kozlovs were already planning their next moves. The war against corruption would continue. But tonight, justice had won a battle worth fighting. 2 weeks after the shootout at Pier 47, Detective James Carter sat in a federal courthouse conference room that had been converted into a war room. The walls were covered with organizational charts showing the full scope of Kozlov's corruption network, a web so complex it resembled a spider's nest more than a criminal conspiracy. Special Agent Chun placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of him and took her seat across the table. Dark circles under her eyes spoke to the sleepless nights they'd all been enduring as the investigation expanded beyond anyone's worst expectations. "The final tally," she said, sliding a thick folder across to James. 73 law enforcement officers across 5 agencies. 12 federal judges. 8 prosecutors. 4 mayors. 2 governors. And 1 sitting United States senator. James opened the folder, scanning names he recognized, colleagues he'd worked with, officials he'd respected, leaders he'd trusted. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. "Senator Williams?" James asked, staring at a photograph of the man who'd chaired the Senate subcommittee on organized crime. "He's been leading the fight against trafficking for 3 years. "Leading the fight to protect trafficking," Chun corrected bitterly. "Every piece of anti-trafficking legislation that died in committee, every investigation that got mysteriously defunded, every witness who suddenly refused to testify, it all traces back to Williams protecting Kozlov's interests." The anti-trafficking senator who'd been publicly fighting organized crime was actually its most powerful protector, using his position to sabotage investigations from within the government itself. Detective Park entered the conference room, walking slowly but without assistance. Her shoulder wound was healing well, but James could see the psychological toll in her eyes, the same haunted look he'd seen in his own mirror every morning. "The women are asking for you," Park said to James. "Anya specifically. They're being processed for witness protection, but she won't cooperate until she talks to you." James pushed back from the table. For 2 weeks, he'd been so buried in paperwork and debriefings that he'd barely had time to think about the 23 women whose lives they'd saved. The investigation had consumed everything, but those women were the reason they'd fought in the first place. The witness protection facility was a nondescript office building downtown, but security was federal-level tight. James went through 3 checkpoints before being escorted to a conference room where Anya waited. She looked different, healthier, less haunted, wearing clothes that actually fit. But her eyes still held that sharp intelligence that had helped them survive the pier. "Detective Carter," she said, rising to shake his hand formally. "I wanted to thank you before I disappear forever." "You don't need to thank me," James replied. "You saved my life back there. We saved each other." Anya smiled sadly. "In my country, I was Lieutenant Anya Petrov, Romanian Special Forces. Anti-terrorism unit. But when I tried to investigate trafficking routes through Eastern Europe, I learned that criminals had friends in very high places." James sat down across from her, beginning to understand. "They didn't just kidnap you randomly. No. They targeted me specifically. Made me disappear, broke me down, turned me into just another victim. It was supposed to be a message to other officers who might interfere with their business." Anya wasn't just a trafficking victim. She was a foreign military officer who'd been specifically targeted and kidnapped to prevent her from exposing an international trafficking network. The implications hit James like a sledgehammer. If Kozlov's organization was sophisticated enough to neutralize foreign military personnel, their reach extended far beyond American corruption. "Anya, what you're telling me," This changes everything. You're not just a witness, you're a victim of international terrorism. Yes, she agreed. And that is why I cannot simply disappear into your witness protection program. My government believes I am dead. My unit believes I betrayed them. I cannot start a new life until I clear my name and complete my mission. James leaned forward. What mission? To identify and destroy the trafficking routes between Romania, Russia, and America. Your Viktor Kozlov was just one node in a network that spans continents. Killing him was a victory, but the network still exists. The weight of her words settled on James's shoulders. They'd thought Pier 47 was the end of the story. Instead, it was barely the beginning. Agent Chun appeared in the doorway. Carter, we need you back in the war room. Priority intelligence just came in. James looked at Anya. This isn't over, is it? For us, tonight was liberation, she replied. But for the network, tonight was just Tuesday. They will adapt, rebuild, find new corrupt officials to protect them. Unless what? Unless we stop running separate investigations and start working together. Romanian Special Forces, FBI, your internal affairs, Interpol. All of us, coordinating to destroy the entire network. James stood up, feeling the familiar weight of a mission that was bigger than himself. What are you proposing? I am proposing we finish what we started. Not as victims and rescuers, but as partners. As soldiers in a war that needs to be won. James realized that solving the corruption in his own department was just the first step in a much larger international fight against organized crime networks that had infiltrated governments worldwide. Back in the war room, Agent Chun spread new intelligence photos across the table. Surveillance footage from airports in New York, Miami, and Los Angeles. Shipping manifests from cargo containers entering American ports. Financial records from offshore accounts linked to the Kozlov organization. Viktor Kozlov's death created a power vacuum, Chin explained. But instead of the network collapsing, it's reorganizing. His brother Dmitry is taking control, and he's accelerating operations. New shipments every week, expanded corruption networks, increased violence against anyone who interferes. Detective Foster, who'd been quietly reviewing files in the corner, looked up with grim determination. So what are we saying? That everything we did at the pier was pointless. Not pointless, James replied, studying the photographs of Dmitry Kozlov. It was the opening move in a bigger game. And now we know how deep this really goes. Park moved to the organizational chart on the wall. If we're going to take down a network this size, we need resources we don't have. Federal task forces, international cooperation, witness protection for dozens of people. We need political support from officials we can actually trust, Chin added. And given how many politicians are compromised, that's going to be nearly impossible. James thought about Anya's words, about finishing what they'd started, about working as soldiers in a war that needed to be won. The investigation had shown him that corruption wasn't just about bad cops taking bribes. It was about criminal organizations systematically destroying the institutions that were supposed to protect innocent people. Then we build our own network, James said finally. Clean cops, honest agents, untouchable prosecutors. We mirror their structure, but for justice instead of profit. Chun raised an eyebrow. You're talking about creating an underground law enforcement network operating outside normal channels. I'm talking about saving the system by working around the parts that are broken, James corrected. We use legal methods, but we coordinate privately. Share intelligence, protect witnesses, build cases that can't be corrupted from within. Foster closed his file and looked up at James with new respect. That's either brilliant or completely insane. Maybe both, James admitted. But right now, it's all we've got. As evening fell over the city, James stood at the conference room window, looking out at the lights of a metropolis that was both beautiful and broken. Somewhere out there, Dmitry Kozlov was rebuilding his brother's empire. Corrupt officials were covering their tracks. New victims were being trafficked through ports and airports that were supposed to be secure. But also out there were Anya and 22 other survivors who'd found their freedom. Detective Park, Foster, Kim, and others who'd risked everything for justice. Agent Chun and the honest federal agents who'd responded when it mattered most. The war was far from over. But for the first time since this all began, James believed they had a real chance to win it. 3 months after Viktor Kozlov's death, Detective James Carter stood in the basement of St. Mary's Community Church, surrounded by the most unlikely coalition he'd ever assembled. 16 people sat around a collection of mismatched tables: FBI agents, local detectives, prosecutors, immigration officers, and Anya Petrov, now operating under deep cover as a liaison with Interpol. They called themselves the Network, a deliberately vague name for what had become the most effective anti-corruption task force in the city's history. Dmitry Kozlov isn't just rebuilding his brother's operation, Agent Chun reported, projecting surveillance photos onto a portable screen. He's expanding it. New routes through the port of Baltimore, fresh corruption payments to officials we hadn't even identified before, and... She paused, her expression darkening. He's importing professional killers from the Russian military. James studied the photographs of heavily armed men disembarking from cargo ships. These weren't street thugs or corrupt cops. These were Spetsnaz operatives, Russian Special Forces soldiers with training that made American police look like mall security guards. How many? Detective Park asked from her position near the door. She'd volunteered to coordinate security for their meetings, a role that required constant vigilance against surveillance. At least 12 that we can identify, Chin replied. But given Dmitry's resources and his brother's death, we have to assume more are coming. Anya leaned forward, her expression grim. In Romania, we tracked similar operations. When Russian organized crime imports military personnel, it means they're preparing for war. Not business competition, actual war. Dmitry Kozlov wasn't just rebuilding his brother's criminal empire, he was militarizing it, bringing in professional soldiers to wage actual warfare against law enforcement. James felt the familiar weight of escalating stakes. What had started as an internal affairs investigation into racist cops had evolved into an international conflict with professional military implications. What's their target priority? Asked Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Martinez, one of the few prosecutors they determined was completely clean. Are they going after witnesses, law enforcement, or government officials? All three, Anya replied. But based on intelligence from Romanian contacts, their first priority will be eliminating everyone who was at Pier 47. They want to send a message that killing a Kozlov has consequences. Detective Foster shifted uncomfortably in his chair. So we're all marked for death. Again. Not just us, James said, reviewing the latest intelligence reports. Our families, our colleagues, anyone connected to the investigation. Dmitry isn't interested in surgical strikes. He wants to burn down everything that threatens his operation. The weight of that revelation settled over the room like a funeral shroud. They'd all signed up to risk their own lives, but putting families in danger changed the equation dramatically. There's more, Chin continued. We've intercepted communications suggesting that Dmitry has made contact with corrupt officials at the highest levels of government. Not just local politicians, federal judges, congressional representatives, possibly even Supreme Court justices. The corruption network extended all the way to the Supreme Court, meaning that even successful prosecutions could be overturned by compromised justices. James stood up, moving to a whiteboard where they'd mapped out the known corruption network. The web of red lines connecting names and organizations had grown so complex it looked like abstract art. If they owned Supreme Court justices, he said slowly, then traditional prosecution is impossible. Even if we build perfect cases, they'll be dismissed on technicalities or overturned on appeal. So what are you suggesting? Martinez asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. I'm suggesting we stop trying to work within a system that's been corrupted beyond repair, James replied. We document everything, gather irrefutable evidence, and then we go public. Not through official channels that can be suppressed, but through media, social networks, direct citizen involvement. Anya nodded approvingly. In Eastern Europe, we call this sunshine warfare. Make the corruption so visible that denial becomes impossible. But even as they planned their public exposure strategy, James knew they were racing against time. Professional military operators didn't waste weeks planning elaborate schemes, they struck fast and hard. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Check the parking lot. You have company. James's blood turned to ice. He held up his hand for silence and pointed toward the basement windows. Through the glass, he could see shadows moving between the parked cars in the church lot. We're blown, he whispered. Park was already moving, checking her sidearm and moving to the basement's rear exit. How many? Can't tell. At least 4, maybe more. James drew his Glock and gestured for the civilians to take cover behind the tables. Chun, call for backup. On what frequency? Chun replied grimly. We don't know which departments are compromised. The network found itself under assault by professional military operatives in the basement of a church, with no way to call for help through normal law enforcement channels. The first explosive charge detonated against the basement's front entrance, blowing the steel door off its hinges and filling the room with smoke and debris. Through the haze, James saw tactical flashlights and heard the coordinated movement of professional soldiers. Federal agents, a voice shouted in accented English. Surrender and you will not be harmed. Bullshit, Foster muttered, taking position behind an overturned table. They're not here to arrest us. James agreed. Professional killers didn't announce themselves as federal agents unless they were planning to stage the scene afterward. This was an execution disguised as a raid. Everyone stay low and move toward the rear exit, James ordered. Anya, take Martinez and the civilians out the back. The rest of us will. A flashbang grenade exploded in the center of the room, temporarily blinding everyone and turning sound into white noise. Through the disorientation, James heard automatic weapons fire, not single shots like police would use, but sustained bursts from military assault rifles. He rolled behind better cover as bullets shredded the air where he'd been standing. These weren't cops or even corrupt cops. These were soldiers following rules of engagement that didn't include taking prisoners. Rear exit is blocked. Park shouted from the back of the basement. More hostiles outside. They were trapped. 16 people in a basement, facing professional military operators armed with superior weapons and equipment. The math was simple and terrifying. But James had learned something during his months investigating corruption. Sometimes the only way to fight an unfair system was to refuse to play by its rules. Chen, he called out during a brief lull in the shooting. That evidence package we prepared, the one with everything about the Supreme Court corruption. What about it? Send it. Right now. Every media outlet, every social media platform, every contact we have. If we're going to die tonight, we make sure the truth dies with us. Chen's laptop was somehow still functional despite the chaos. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as bullets sparked off the concrete walls around them. Uploading to 17 different platforms simultaneously, she reported, including WikiLeaks, major newspapers, and about 50,000 Twitter followers. Facing certain death, James realized their only weapon was the truth itself, and their willingness to release everything they knew, regardless of the consequences. The shooting suddenly stopped. In the silence that followed, James could hear his own heartbeat and the quiet sobbing of someone who'd been hit. A new voice called out from the shattered entrance, American accent, official tone, "This is Assistant Director Morrison, FBI. Cease fire and surrender. This is your final warning." James felt his world tilt. Morrison was supposed to be dead, killed by Kozlov during the cleanup operation. Morrison's alive? Chen whispered, her face pale in the emergency lighting. Or someone's using his identity, James replied. But deep down, he knew the truth was worse. Morrison hadn't been killed by Kozlov. He'd faked his death to go deeper underground with the corruption network. Assistant Director Morrison had faked his death to become Dmitry Kozlov's primary law enforcement asset, giving the criminal organization unprecedented access to federal resources and intelligence. "Detective Carter," Morrison's voice continued, "you and your people have caused considerable disruption to ongoing federal operations. Surrender now, and I guarantee you'll receive fair treatment under federal custody." James almost laughed at the absurdity. Fair treatment from a man who'd been working with human traffickers and murderers. "Counteroffer, Morrison," James called back. "Go to hell." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Automatic weapons fire from multiple directions, coordinated tactical movement, professional military assault on a basement full of cops and prosecutors who'd committed the crime of being honest. But as James returned fire with his service pistol, he realized something that gave him hope even in the face of certain death. Chen's uploads had succeeded. Thousands of documents detailing corruption at every level of government were now spreading across the internet faster than any organization could suppress them. They might not survive the night. But the truth would. 23 minutes after Agent Chen hit upload, the basement of St. Mary's Community Church became the epicenter of a digital earthquake that would reshape American law enforcement forever. James Carter pressed himself against the concrete wall as another burst of automatic weapons fire shredded the air above his head. But through his earpiece, miraculously still functional, he could hear something that changed everything. His phone was ringing. Not just ringing, exploding with notifications, calls, alerts from news organizations around the world. "Carter!" Chin shouted from behind an overturned filing cabinet. "It's working. The evidence is everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, major news networks, international media. They can't suppress it." Assistant Director Morrison's voice crackled over a bullhorn. "Cease fire. Cease fire." But James could hear the panic underneath the authority. The plan to quietly eliminate the network had become a very public massacre. Detective Park, bleeding from a graze across her forehead, managed to access her phone during a brief lull. "Holy shit," she breathed. "We're trending worldwide. Hashtag Supreme Court corruption, hashtag Kozlov conspiracy, hashtag FBI_coverup. 40 million views in the last 10 minutes. The real-time release of corruption evidence during an active assault created a global media firestorm that made covering up the attack impossible. James heard shouting from outside the basement, not the tactical communications of professional soldiers, but the chaos of an operation falling apart. Morrison's carefully planned elimination had become a live-streamed international incident. "Sir, we have news helicopters circling the building," someone reported through Morrison's radio. "Local PD is requesting clarification on the federal operation." Morrison's response was sharp with desperation. "Jam their frequencies. No media contact." But it was too late. The evidence Chen had uploaded included real-time GPS coordinates, detailed operational plans, and most damaging of all, audio recordings of Morrison coordinating with Dmitry Kozlov. Anya, who'd been quietly working her own contacts, looked up from her secure phone with fierce satisfaction. Romanian intelligence is requesting immediate extradition proceedings for human trafficking suspects. Interpol has issued red notices for 12 individuals named in our files. The UN is calling for emergency sessions on international corruption. The basement shootout had inadvertently triggered the largest international law enforcement crisis in modern history, with evidence of corruption spreading too fast and too wide to contain. James's phone rang, a number he recognized as Captain Rodriguez's old direct line. Someone had taken over his office. "Carter, this is Deputy Chief Williams," a voice said. Not the corrupt Williams who'd been arrested, but his replacement. "Are you alive in there?" "For now," James replied, watching Morrison's soldiers through the smoke and debris. "But we've got federal agents trying to kill us." "Those aren't federal agents," Williams said grimly. "Real FBI units are en route. What you're facing are Russian military contractors using stolen federal equipment. Morrison's been working with Dmitry Kozlov to stage a fake raid." The revelation hit James like lightning. Morrison hadn't just faked his death. He'd orchestrated an elaborate deception using Russian operatives dressed as federal agents. But the public release of evidence had exposed the operation before it could be completed and covered up. "How long until real backup arrives?" James asked. 3 minutes. "But Carter, when this is over, you need to know the scope of what you've uncovered. The files Chen uploaded, they've triggered mass resignations at DOJ, emergency congressional hearings, and international arrest warrants for sitting Supreme Court justices." James felt the weight of historical moment settling on his shoulders. They hadn't just exposed corruption, they'd accidentally triggered a constitutional crisis. Through the basement windows, James could see the strobing lights of legitimate law enforcement vehicles arriving. Real FBI tactical teams, uniformed officers from multiple departments, even military vehicles that suggested federal marshals or other high-level agencies. Morrison's voice over the bullhorn had changed from authoritative to desperate. "All units, execute Contingency Plan Alpha. Complete the mission and extract." But his federal agents were professional enough to recognize a lost cause. James heard rapid tactical communications in what sounded like Russian, followed by the distinctive sounds of professional soldiers conducting a fighting withdrawal. "They're pulling out," Foster reported from his position near the shattered entrance. "Moving fast toward the parking lot." James made a command decision that went against every tactical principle he'd ever learned. He broke cover and moved toward the entrance, gesturing for his people to stay down. "Morrison!" he shouted into the smoky chaos outside. "It's over. The whole world is watching. Surrender and maybe you'll live to see a trial." Morrison appeared in the doorway, no longer the polished federal administrator James had known, but a desperate man whose entire world was collapsing in real time. His tactical gear was scorched, his face streaked with sweat and cordite residue. "You have no idea what you've done," Morrison snarled, raising his rifle. "Kozlov's organization spans continents. You think exposing a few corrupt officials changes anything? There are 1,000 more ready to take their places." "Maybe," James replied, his own weapon trained on Morrison. "But right now, the whole world knows their names, their bank accounts, and their crimes. Good luck hiding from 7 billion people with internet access." Behind Morrison, James could see genuine federal tactical teams surrounding the building. Professional soldiers who moved with American military precision, not Russian contractor chaos. Morrison seemed to realize his situation was hopeless. But instead of surrendering, He smiled with the cold satisfaction of a man who'd accepted his own destruction. "Dimitri sends his regards," Morrison said, reaching for something on his tactical vest. Morrison was carrying a suicide device intended to destroy evidence and kill remaining witnesses, even as the real authorities arrived. James had a split second to act. Morrison's hand was moving toward what looked like a detonator, either a bomb or a dead man switch connected to something larger. Time slowed to crystalline clarity. James could see Anya moving to tackle Morrison from the side. Chun diving to protect the laptop containing additional evidence. Park rolling toward better cover while shouting warnings to the approaching tactical teams. James fired once, center mass. Morrison crumpled, the detonator falling from nerveless fingers to skitter across concrete. But as James moved to secure the device, Morrison managed one last vindictive smile. "Too late, Carter," he wheezed, blood frothing at his lips. Dimensional charges, set throughout the building, dead man switch, 10 seconds. The basement filled with the frantic voices of people who'd survived a firefight only to face death by explosion. James grabbed the detonator, but the countdown was already running. 7 seconds. Everyone out. James screamed, but he knew they'd never make it to safety in time. 6 seconds. Anya appeared beside him, her fingers flying over the detonator's display. "Romanian Special Forces training," she said grimly. "Bomb disposal. 5 seconds. Can you stop it?" 4 seconds. "I don't know," she admitted, her hands steady despite everything. "But I'm going to try." 3 seconds. James watched this woman, who'd survived trafficking, torture, and multiple firefights, risk everything one more time to save people she'd only known for months. 2 seconds. "Got it," Anya breathed, as the countdown froze at 0:01. 1 second that would have changed everything, stopped forever by the steady hands of a soldier who'd refused to give up. The countdown stopped with 1 second remaining. But what will happen to James and his team now that they've exposed the largest corruption scandal in American history? Share your thoughts in the comments about what justice should look like after something this massive. As real federal agents flooded the basement and professional EMTs began treating the wounded, James looked around at his unlikely coalition of heroes. They'd started as an internal affairs investigation into racist cops. They were ending as the catalyst for the largest governmental crisis since Watergate. The network had succeeded beyond their wildest imagination. But as James watched Assistant Director Morrison die on the basement floor, he realized that victory in a war against corruption came with a price that would take years to fully understand. 6 months after the basement shootout at St. Mary's Community Church, Detective James Carter stood in the marble halls of the United States Capitol, wearing his dress uniform and carrying a folder containing testimony that would reshape American law enforcement forever. The congressional hearing room was packed with media, survivors, and families of officers who died fighting corruption. At the witness table sat James, Agent Chun, Detective Park, Anya Petrov, now officially recognized as Lieutenant Petrov of Romanian Special Forces, and Assistant District Attorney Martinez. Senator Elizabeth Warren, now chairing the Senate Judiciary Committee after the arrest of Senator Williams, called the hearing to order. "Detective Carter," she began, "your investigation began with a simple case of racial profiling. It ended with the exposure of the largest government corruption scandal in American history. Please tell this committee, in your own words, how we got here." James leaned toward the microphone, looking out at the packed gallery. In the front row sat the 23 women they'd rescued from Kozlov's trafficking operation, all now living under new identities, but here to bear witness to the system that had failed them and the people who'd fought to make it right. "Senator, it started because I knew 2 racist cops were harassing black citizens in my community," James began. "I parked my car where I knew they'd target me, expecting to document police misconduct. What I discovered was that the corruption wasn't limited to a few bad officers. It had infected every level of our justice system, from local police departments to the Supreme Court itself. James's testimony revealed the complete scope of systemic corruption that had allowed criminal organizations to operate with government protection for over a decade. The evidence your investigation provided has led to unprecedented changes, Senator Warren continued. Can you summarize the impact? Agent Chen leaned toward her microphone. Senator, in the 6 months since our evidence went public, we've seen 127 federal indictments, including 3 Supreme Court justices, 12 federal judges, 47 members of Congress, and over 200 law enforcement officers across 17 states. The numbers still stunned James. What had started as a single undercover operation had triggered the largest housecleaning in American government history. Additionally, Chin continued, our international partners have dismantled trafficking networks in 12 countries, rescued over 400 victims, and arrested more than 1,000 individuals connected to the Kozlov organization. Detective Park addressed the microphone next. But the real victory isn't in the arrests, Senator. It's in the systems we've built to prevent this from happening again. She was referring to the Network Protocol, a new framework for law enforcement that required cross-agency transparency, civilian oversight, and international cooperation that had been implemented across the country. The network that we formed in that church basement, Park explained, has become the model for how honest officers can work together across jurisdictional boundaries to fight corruption. We now have similar networks operating in 43 states. The desperate coalition they'd formed to survive had evolved into a permanent system of reform that was transforming law enforcement nationwide. Senator Warren turned to Anya. Lieutenant Petrov, your testimony has been particularly powerful regarding the international scope of this conspiracy. What message do you have for other victims who might be afraid to come forward? Anya sat straight, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived hell and chosen to fight back. Senator, I want every victim of trafficking, every honest officer afraid of corruption, every citizen who thinks the system cannot change to know this. The truth is more powerful than any criminal organization. When good people work together, we can defeat even the most sophisticated enemies of justice. She paused, looking directly at James. 6 months ago, Detective Carter could have simply documented 2 racist officers and called it a victory. Instead, he chose to dig deeper, to follow the evidence wherever it led, even when it put his life at risk. That choice saved my life, saved the lives of 22 other women, and ultimately saved the integrity of American law enforcement itself. The hearing room erupted in sustained applause. James felt tears he hadn't expected, thinking about Rodriguez, about Martinez, about all the officers who died because they tried to do the right thing in a corrupted system. As the formal hearing concluded, James found himself in the Capitol Rotunda, surrounded by reporters and cameras. The questions came rapid fire. Detective Carter, do you believe corruption has been eliminated? Will you continue working internal affairs? What's next for the network? James raised his hand for quiet. Corruption isn't eliminated, it's just harder to hide. The systems we've built, the transparency we've created, the international cooperation we've established, these things make it much more difficult for criminal organizations to buy protection from government officials. As for what's next, he continued, I've accepted a position as director of the new Federal Integrity Commission. We'll be working with honest officers across the country to implement the network protocol and ensure that what happened with the Kozlov organization can never happen again. But even as he spoke to the media, James's attention was drawn to a quieter conversation happening near the rotunda's edge. Anya was talking with several of the trafficking survivors, translating between languages and helping coordinate their ongoing recovery services. After the reporters dispersed, James approached the group. The young woman who'd first translated for the others in the truck, Maria, from El Salvador, stepped forward. "Detective Carter," she said in careful English, "we wanted to thank you. Not just for saving us, but for making sure the people who hurt us faced justice." "You don't need to thank me," James replied. "You survived. You testified. You helped us stop them from hurting anyone else. That took more courage than anything I did." Anya joined them, and James was struck by how different she looked from the terrified woman they'd pulled from Kozlov's truck. Now she carried herself with the bearing of a professional soldier, but her eyes held warmth instead of just hardened determination. "There is something else," Anya said quietly. "Dmitry Kozlov was found dead in a Russian prison 3 days ago. Officially, it was suicide. Unofficially—" She shrugged. "Even criminal organizations have standards about leaders who get their entire networks exposed." James nodded. Justice came in many forms, not all of them involving American courtrooms. As evening fell over Washington, D.C., James found himself walking down the Capitol steps with Detective Park, Agent Chun, and the core members of what the media had dubbed the Network Heroes. "So what now?" Park asked. "We've got new jobs, new responsibilities, new systems to build. But do you think we actually changed anything, or did we just create new bureaucracies to replace the old corrupt ones?" James considered the question as they walked past the reflecting pool toward their hotels. 6 months ago, he'd been a single detective trying to document racist cops. Tonight, he was the director of a federal agency designed to prevent systemic corruption. "I think," he said finally, "we proved that ordinary people can fight extraordinary evil when they work together. The systems we build might get corrupted someday. All systems do. But we also proved that they can be fixed by people willing to risk everything for justice." Chin nodded toward the Capitol dome, lit against the night sky. "The real victory is that there are thousands of cops, agents, prosecutors, and citizens who saw what we did and decided to get involved themselves. The network isn't just the 6 of us anymore. It's everyone who chooses truth over comfort, justice over corruption." James realized that their victory wasn't just about stopping one criminal organization, but about inspiring a new generation of law enforcement officers who would never accept corruption as normal. A year later, James stood in the same parking lot where this all began, the Westfield shopping center where he'd waited for Martinez and Thompson to harass him for driving while black. But the lot looked different now. A small memorial had been erected near the spot where he'd parked his BMW that night, a plaque honoring officers who died fighting corruption, with Rodriguez's name at the top. Below it, the names of 47 law enforcement officers who'd been killed by criminal organizations for refusing to be bought. Anya approached from across the parking lot, now wearing the dress uniform of a Romanian Special Forces liaison to the FBI. She'd chosen to remain in America, working to coordinate international anti-trafficking operations. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd just driven home that night?" she asked, standing beside him at the memorial. James smiled. "Every day. But then I remember 23 women who are alive and free because I didn't. I remember hundreds of trafficking victims who've been rescued by networks operating in other cities. I remember honest cops who don't have to be afraid to report corruption anymore. And I remember," Anya added, "that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who never intended to become warriors." As they walked back toward their cars, James now driving a sensible government sedan, Anya in a practical FBI vehicle, James reflected on the journey from that first night to this moment. The corruption hadn't been completely eliminated. Probably never would be. But it had been exposed, prosecuted, and systematically countered in ways that would protect future victims and empower future heroes. Most importantly, they'd proved that the system could be saved by people willing to fight for it, even when, especially when, it seemed broken beyond repair. James started his car and pulled out of the parking lot, heading home to a city that was safer, a department that was cleaner, and a future that was brighter because ordinary people had chosen to do extraordinary things. The war against corruption would continue. But tonight, justice had won a victory worth fighting for.